Many moons ago, when I was just a parent of 2 kiddos, and they were little, which meant that they were always at my house. That's not the case anymore. I made a home visit to someone within our church family who had 4 kids, and we were sitting in their kitchen. I still remember this. And I looked up on their refrigerator, and I said, "What is that?" And it was a monthly calendar, color-coded, with every individual in the home and where they needed to be every night. And I said, "Is that your family calendar?" And then I go, "Yeah, each person has a color." I'm like, there is no way you could live like that. Well, hi, it's 2025. And I'm living that life, all right? And the crazy thing is, we have a color-coded calendar. It's a Google calendar. And every entity that we're a part of has its own color, and they just input all their stuff onto my calendar. So instead of being on my fridge, it's now on my phone, and I see it all the time. And think, man, that life that I thought I could never do that, yeah, I'm living it. Can you identify with that, by the way? I'm guessing as you're sitting here, I know, because I know a number of your families, like, you're feeling that. And even if you're not feeling like, color-coded, every night I got to be somewhere, I'm guessing the reality of just about everyone in this room or everyone who's tuning in online can feel the sense of being pulled in a lot of directions. A lot of demands placed on you. A lot of expectations that are thrust upon you. And because of that, you feel pulled, you feel stressed, maybe feel overwhelmed, maybe feel hurried. I was in a small group of people a couple weeks ago, and someone within the group, you could just tell they were stressed and stretched and pulled. And someone else that I was with said, "Don't you ever wish," to the other person, "don't you ever wish you just had more time?" Right? Because you just feel so hurried and pulled. And here's what the other person said. And I just love how she said it. She said, "Well, I'll tell you, if I had another arm, I would just grab another bag." You know what she means by that? Like, it's not about needing more time, because if I had that more time, everything else would fill it, right? So I would just need another arm to grab yet another bag. I don't know if you remember this, but a few years ago, a new iteration of the Apple Watch came out. And they were really proud to announce with the new Apple Watch came a new app. I don't remember exactly what it was called, but maybe it was called Breathe. And what the watch would do would send you a reminder, hey, you probably need to just inhale and exhale for a moment. And my first thought seeing that advertised was, if we need a watch to remind us to breathe, we just might be in trouble. Agree? Geez, oh Pete's would be the phrase on that. And I think the problem is the world presents so much opportunity for us and for you and for your kids and for your grandkids. And there's a sense that, well, we've got to take advantage of every opportunity that's before us. We don't want to miss out, or we don't want our kids or our grandkids to miss out. And every entity around us has no problem like putting more and higher demands on us, which leaves us feeling hurried and pulled. Which is why this Lenten season, our message series is simply called Help for the Hurried. Because if you're like me, we need help. I'm really excited for this one. And I want to tell you off the bat the approach that we're not going to take. We are not going to take the approach of scolding you or telling you what you ought to do or not do. I'm not going to tell you to not be hurried or to quit the things that you're doing. my middle daughter, Megan, at Grace Lake Central High School, is taking a culinary arts class. She loves it. The only problem is, whenever she sees me cooking, she has comments to make about what I'm doing technically wrong. Like, I'm chopping vegetables for soup. She's like, Dad, you cannot chop like that. My teacher would fail you if you chopped like that. I'm like, just let me cook, all right? And then a couple minutes later, I'm washing the knife. She's like, Dad, you cannot, that is very unsafe. You cannot wash a knife like that. I'm like, just give me a break, right? So I am not going to scold you. We are not going to scold you into obedience. The move we want you to make, and I want to invite you to start today, is in the midst of your hurried life and scheduled existence, to look to Jesus. Acknowledge that you feel pulled. Maybe in your own way and in your own terms, say kind of a quiet prayer to Jesus. Lord, I acknowledge that existence is my existence, and I would like to look to you for help and strength and guidance in the midst of it. Here's what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 11. He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." I love this moment in the life of Jesus and his disciples because this language is incredibly invitational. In the midst of your hurried life, come to me. That's what we're going to invite you to do over the course of these next few weeks. To look to Jesus, to lean into Jesus. And that's really what the season of Lent is about. A time of preparation for Easter, for us each individually to turn to Jesus in the midst of our daily lives. And the neat thing is, this is not just like a New Testament move that Jesus makes. This is what the God of the Old Testament invites us into as well. If only we had someone here who kind of knew the Old Testament really well, who could help us navigate what that Old Testament life was like. Oh my goodness, Sarah Salzberg, you're here! Round of applause for our guest today, Sarah Salzberg. Hello, Sarah. So I want to introduce you to a friend of mine. We got to serve together at a camp in northern Michigan last summer. Sarah hails from Los Angeles, California. She is a teacher, a student and teacher of the Old Testament. Yes. And she was very generous to come to be with us this weekend to lead our women's retreat. And from what I hear, it was wildly successful. So Sarah, thanks for taking the time to be with us this weekend. And I thought, hey, if Sarah's here, let's get a chance to hear from Sarah just a little bit. And Sarah, I know I sent you some questions. We're going to kind of scrap those questions a little bit.
Only a pastor would do that, not a teacher.
Correct.
You lesson planned? It doesn't matter. No, thank you.
So I guess what I want to start with is, you kind of heard the opening move I made. I'd like to hear what you would respond to that in terms of like, how do we see that vision that God has for his people to rest in him? How does that play out in the Old Testament?
Yeah. Well, I will say, so I've taught the Old Testament for 18 years, and I look young, thank you. I don't know why you're laughing. I'm truly, the Old Testament is what I care about. I have my master's in Leviticus.
Who doesn't?
Who doesn't, really? Who doesn't open that book and go, this is worth studying more? And so I spent a lot of time trying to understand this, and I'm born and raised LCMS, and I don't know if this is your experience, but my experience was that I was always taught that Judaism was about legalism, meaning like that they followed all the laws because they were worried God was going to get mad at them. And it was how it was framed, like modern Judaism, but then that also meant that's how the Old Testament was kind of colored for me. And trying to understand as I was reading through it, why do they practice all of these things? And I'm sure, so the Sabbath law is listed in two different verses in the Torah. And so in Exodus, it is listed as one of the 10 words. And it says, remember the Sabbath day. And it talks about you do so because at creation, God created in 7 days, and then he rested from all the work that he had done. But it's interesting because then he repeats it in Deuteronomy after their 40 years of wandering, and he changes it. He says, you remember the Sabbath day because you once were slaves, and you have been freed from that. And so understanding the Old Testament doesn't present it like legalism, it presents it as a gift. That this celebration of the Sabbath and the practice, the ritual practice of the Sabbath is meant to liberate you to rest. Yeah. And that gift that God gives. And so my husband's extended family is Jewish. His dad, I didn't say this in the first one, his dad became a Christian in college listening to Lutheran Hour radio. Ooh. Said no one ever. But he did. And so my husband's extended family is Jewish, and we live in Los Angeles. My husband's in the film industry. We have a lot of friends who are Jewish. And I will never forget the first time we were invited to Shabbat. Have any of you got to go to Shabbat? Has anybody ever been invited to Shabbat? If you get invited, you go. I was terrified. I was nervous to go because I thought it was going to be so boring. And I thought this is going to be just a lot of everybody is upset and dreary and oh no, God hates us. And I was expecting there to be all these rituals like I won't know what I'm supposed to do and everyone's going to think I'm an idiot. And I was so nervous. And I walked into his uncle's house, and I remember in the backyard we went through, turned the corner, and there was just a giant pile of roasted meat. Mm-hmm. And a giant pile of roasted vegetables. And we walked into their dining room, and it was just filled with desserts. And then there was a big old table of wine. And when sun went down, we partied. And we ate, and we drank, and we sang, and we danced. And when I didn't know the words, they taught me the words, and then they translated the words. And it was this gift, and it was so just life-giving. And I jokingly at the end of the night said, they were like, so glad you came. I said, this was amazing. When are we doing this again? And they're like, next week. And I think for me, that was a good reminder of, it really butted up against what I thought about some of these ritual practices. And I talked more about it with a friend, and I said, I'm sorry, I thought you celebrated all these things and you performed these rituals because you were worried God was mad at you and you wanted to, make sure that he knew that you loved him. And he said, no, we know how much God loves us. That's why we poured more wine. And I think that is a good reminder of, as you go through all of the stuff, that's the worldview Jesus is entering into. And don't get me wrong, he does want to correct anybody that has turned it into legalism. Yeah. But his goal is that you would see that this is a gift. It's a time of rest. And so the other thing I like to remember is that you guys are familiar with the temple, right? Okay, so the temple is God's presence. It's the place where God has chosen to be present in terms of space. Isn't God available in all of creation? Isn't he present in all of creation?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so then why do you need a temple? He's everywhere. Oh, this is the space where you have access. This is the space where it's set aside to be where you can meet God. And so if you think of the tabernacle as God's presence in terms of space, I talk about Sabbath as the tabernacle of time. It's God's presence in terms of time. Is God with you always? Yes. But Sabbath is that time to set aside to be with God in that presence and also be with one another. And so Sabbath has to be done together.
That's awesome. Thanks so much for that. And, as someone who knows the scriptures, you know the heart of God, what do you...
I don't know it perfectly.
We're all
working on it.
But what message do you think in light of help for the hurried?
Yeah.
What message do you think the Lord would have for you, Sarah, as a mom and a teacher and a wife, and for our people about hey, what am I offering you?
Yeah. My two things that came to mind, and one was confirmed after looking through this guy. This is impressive.
It's awesome.
You should be very proud of your kids.
Yeah.
Also, invite them into the conversations that you guys have. They are eager to have them with you, and they have something valuable to say. But I would say my two things are, in the verse, I told you I'm dyed-in-the-wool Lutheran, in that verse that Jesus says, sometimes I catch myself that I change Jesus' words because they don't, this sounds weird, but like they don't sound Lutheran enough. Because I always change it in my mind when he says, come to me all you who are weary and heavy laden and I will give you rest. I change it to, take all your burdens off. You don't have any more. But it doesn't say that. He says, take my yoke upon you. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And so this notion of he's actually gifting, Sabbath is a gift that is given, but it's not a burden.
Yeah.
That's where the two things that I would say, it's kind of two sides of the same coin. That practicing Sabbath is not convenient. But it's also not a burden. And I saw, I don't know if he's in the room. I couldn't tell from the face. Kyle Streckert. Is he in the room?
Kyle!
What, Kyle? I was flipping through. I was like, oh, this is really cool. And I got to, he said, let's choose today to rest in him, not because it's easy, but because he's worth trusting. Guys, that's a child of your congregation. How cool is that? But the thing I thought about is, it's not convenient to do that, to say I'm going to commit to this. And I don't want you, as you start to think about what kind of Sabbath practice you can have, number one, it has to be done in community. Our culture talks a lot about rest, and sometimes the church then does the same thing here, but we make it an individual thing. Shabbat is not individual, it is communal. You do this with other people. But it's not convenient to always say, I'm going to do this in this way. But I don't ever want it to be something where you feel like I have to do this, otherwise I've blown it, or God's mad, or whatever it is. So I shared in the first session, my teaching partner, he and his family practice Shabbat. They're at a different life stage than I am. Their kids are in high school and college, but they go to college around their community college. Woo woo! That's my plug for community college. But they do every Friday night, they do pizza dinner. And they make pizza together, but my teaching partner does all of the prep work ahead of time so that once it's time to do it, there's no work to be done. We just get to put the pizzas in, and we get to have fun, and we hang out, and they talk about things, and they just celebrate and do this as a family. But the side of it being a commitment but not a burden is it's on the books. It's Friday night. We're going to do that. But let's say there's something you can't move. You've got something going on, or one of you's traveling out of town, you've got a wedding, whatever it is. If not everyone's in the house, they don't do it. They don't make the person feel bad. They just say, we're okay, we're not going to do that tonight. But when their kids have a choice of, do you want to hang out with your friends on Friday night or Saturday night? Oh, I've got something going on Friday night. Let's do this Saturday night. And wherever you're able to find that practice where it becomes a ritual that reminds you of the gift that Jesus has given, that it's not a burden. It's a time to connect with one another and to recognize we like to think we have dominion over time, right? That's why we make calendars. Like we act like we have control over time. It's the dumb thing we think. And it's a reminder like we don't, but God does. God has dominion over time, and he knows that you are either working or you're dead. That's how we are treating ourselves. And he says, well, you don't stop because the work's all done. You stop because the work's never going to be done. Yeah. But I want to be present with you.
Yeah. And I thought that's such a good word as we're kicking off this series, because what I heard Sarah say is like this Sabbath practice, which we're going to work on over the course of these next couple of weeks, like finding rest in the Lord, is both like obligation, like you got to seek it out. Like Kyle said, it's not going to be easy. But let's never make it a burden or an obligation or a have to. It's a get to, right? And so as we talk over the course of these next few weeks, as you hear it, if I start to drift toward like have to, like maybe check me and I'll try to check myself. But underneath all of this is a God who says, I want to be with you. Right? And what a gift it is, and it's a gift we all need. Yeah. Hey, can you guys thank Sarah for being with us this weekend and for coming up here? This was so fun. We're going to do it again.
I'll do it again.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. Hey, in a few minutes, we